May 16, 1945, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The war in Europe had just ended. Across the Atlantic, the wreckage of Hitler's empire lay in ruins. German soldiers were surrendering by the thousands. Cities were flattened. Civilians were starving. But here, deep in the American South, the scene couldn't be more different. On a bright spring morning, a train pulled into the quiet station just outside Camp Ruston. It looked like any other military transport. Olive-drab rail cars, a few soldiers in uniform, and government tags on every car. But something was off. The train doors slid open. Inside weren't battle-hardened soldiers or high-ranking officers. Inside were women, German women. They looked stunned, not because they were now prisoners of a former enemy, but because of something far stranger. There were no guards watching them, no rifles, no handcuffs, no shouting. Just quiet US soldiers chatting on the platform, uninterested in keeping a close eye on the enemy. The women looked around, unsure if it was a trap. In Germany, such a thing would have been unthinkable. In America, it was protocol. One of the women, a 22-year-old Luftwaffe communications assistant, whispered to another, "Ich kann es nicht glauben. Sie lassen uns einfach laufen?" I can't believe this. They're just letting us walk? For decades, this moment was left out of history books. Overshadowed by the storm of Europe's collapse and the drama of the Pacific War, few knew that hundreds of German women, some soldiers, some civilian auxiliaries, were brought to the United States as prisoners of war. Fewer still knew how they were treated. Some rode trains across the country, unguarded. Some were given medical treatment better than what they received at home. And some left the war questioning everything they thought they knew about the enemy. Who were these women? How did they end up here, thousands of miles from the battlefields of Europe? Why did the US treat them with a level of dignity even they didn't expect? And most importantly, what do their forgotten stories tell us about war, morality, and the human capacity for grace, even in the darkest times? This isn't a tale of battlefield heroics or epic tank battles. This is a story of silence, of confusion, of cultural whiplash, and of how a nation at war treated its enemies in ways no one, friend or foe, could quite understand. In the next 25 minutes, we'll uncover the truth behind one of World War II's strangest, least discussed realities: the journey of German women POWs across the American homeland. From Nazi ideology to Red Cross uniforms, from Allied surrender zones to Louisiana bayous, from warships to empty train cars. This is the true account of a war most people never saw. One filled with paradoxes, and one that begins with a single question echoing through an open train door. Where are the guards? To understand how German women ended up as POWs in the United States, we need to step back, deep into the heart of the Nazi war machine. When World War II began in 1939, the Third Reich was built on strict ideals. One of the core Nazi beliefs was that a woman's place was in the home, raising children and supporting the state through motherhood, not combat. Adolf Hitler and his inner circle made this ideology clear. Men would fight, women would nurture. But war has a way of shattering ideology. As the Wehrmacht expanded across Europe and the demands of total war grew, Germany's need for manpower became unsustainable. Slowly but surely, the Nazi regime was forced to bend its own rules. By the early 1940s, hundreds of thousands of German women were serving, not as frontline soldiers, but as critical support personnel. They became Helferinnen, female auxiliaries, recruited to support the Luftwaffe, Kriegsmarine, and Wehrmacht. These women took on roles such as radio operators, typists, clerks, telephone operators, nurses, translators, and even cryptographers. Many were posted to military installations across Germany and occupied territories, working in direct proximity to combat zones. These weren't civilians in the traditional sense. Although not combat troops, Helferinnen wore uniforms, swore oaths to Hitler, and were considered part of the German war apparatus. Some were members of the National Socialist Women's League or affiliated with Nazi paramilitary organizations. Others worked with the German Red Cross, which, under Nazi control, became deeply involved in military operations, often operating near the front lines. Their motivations varied. Some believed in Nazi ideology, some volunteered out of patriotic duty or family pressure. Others were simply looking for work, stability, or a way out of bombed cities. Regardless of motive, their service placed them in harm's way and on the radar of Allied forces. As the tide of war turned and the Allies advanced through Europe, many of these women were caught in surrender zones. In Italy, France, the Low Countries, and eventually Germany itself, thousands of Helferinnen and Red Cross workers were captured. Unlike male soldiers, their fate was uncertain. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had little precedent for large numbers of female military prisoners. Initially, Allied command didn't know exactly what to do with them. Were they civilians? Soldiers? War criminals? Non-combatants? Should they be detained or repatriated? These questions weren't academic. They affected policy, treatment, and logistics. American and British forces soon adopted a working classification. Women who had worn uniforms, worked under military command, or operated in military zones would be treated as POWs, just like their male counterparts. This included thousands of women in Helferinnen roles. And this decision led to one of the most unexpected logistical challenges of the entire war effort: housing, transporting, and guarding female prisoners in a military system entirely built around men. In total, over 400,000 Axis POWs were held in the United States during World War II. Of those, only a few hundred were women. They were such a small minority that they were often forgotten in records, scattered in small groups, and sometimes placed in isolated barracks within larger male camps. Their treatment was, in many ways, shaped more by the confusion of the bureaucracy than by cruelty or care. What's more surprising, though, is the fact that these women weren't just quietly held. Some were transferred thousands of miles from Europe to US soil, by sea and train, often across unsecured or minimally guarded routes. So why bring them to America at all? The answer lies in the combination of wartime logistics and political calculation. Europe was flooded with displaced people. The US had resources, land, and secured infrastructure. Transporting Axis POWs, including women, to American camps allowed the Allies to clear space in Europe for other operations and to keep prisoners in controlled, monitored environments away from the chaos of post-war Europe. But this set up the central contradiction of our story. The Reich had trained these women to believe the Americans were monsters, unforgiving, brutal, uncivilized. And yet, upon arriving in the United States, these women found something entirely unexpected: decent meals, medical care, respectful guards, and, in some cases, freedom to walk across train platforms with no one watching them. This wasn't a Disney version of captivity. It was still prison. But it wasn't the horror they'd been told to expect. The shock, confusion, and often emotional responses these women experienced stemmed directly from the contrast between what Nazi propaganda had drilled into them and what American policy actually looked like. Before we dive into those unguarded train journeys, we need to look at how these women were actually captured and processed, and why their treatment, from the very beginning, was so different from the men. The capture of German women during World War II wasn't planned. It happened as a byproduct of chaos, of collapsing fronts, sudden surrenders, and the sheer unpredictability of war. When the Allied forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, they began a rapid advance through German-occupied territories. Town after town fell, and with them came not only male German soldiers, but also the women who worked behind the lines. Unlike the mass captures of Wehrmacht infantry or SS divisions, the detention of female auxiliaries was sporadic, often improvised. Many of the women were taken in the same sweeps that rounded up military units or German installations. In Italy, France, Belgium, and eventually within Germany itself, Allied troops found women in uniform operating switchboards, processing documents, organizing supplies, or serving in medical roles near command posts. In some cases, they were taken by surprise. Some had never even seen combat and didn't realize they were considered legitimate military targets. They weren't carrying weapons. They had no formal combat training. Yet they wore uniforms and carried documentation proving affiliation with the German military or the Nazi-controlled Red Cross. According to the Geneva Convention, that made them fair game. Still, this created a dilemma. The Allies had detailed procedures for dealing with captured male combatants, but none for women. American soldiers, many of whom had never encountered enemy women in any combat context, were uncertain how to handle them. Were they prisoners of war? Were they collaborators? Were they civilians in uniform? The US military eventually decided to err on the side of structure. Women who wore the insignia of a military or paramilitary organization were classified as POWs under the same legal standards as male soldiers. This decision, while logical, had massive logistical consequences. The first issue was housing. None of the Allied POW camps in Europe or the US were designed with female prisoners in mind. There were no protocols for medical care specific to women, no female guards, and no facilities adapted for their needs. For this reason, female POWs were initially kept in temporary detention centers, former schools, convents, or makeshift military compounds, while higher-level decisions were made. By late 1944, as the numbers of female detainees slowly increased, the decision was made. Select groups of women would be shipped to the United States, along with male POWs, and detained in secure locations on American soil. These transfers were kept quiet. There was no public announcement. In many cases, even camp personnel weren't told in advance that women were arriving. The transport process was arduous. Female prisoners were taken from European holding areas, often near French ports like Le Havre or Cherbourg, and loaded onto troop ships that had been converted to transport Axis POWs. These ships, while generally safe from German attack by late 1944, were still basic and heavily guarded. Women were kept in separate quarters, away from the larger groups of male prisoners. The journey across the Atlantic could take anywhere from 10 to 20 days, depending on weather and routing. During these voyages, prisoners were given minimal rations, closely monitored, and kept under tight security. Once they arrived, usually at ports like Norfolk, Virginia, or New York City, they were processed by military officials, often still unclear about exactly what category these women belonged in. From there, they were loaded onto trains and transported to designated POW camps across the country. Camp Ruston in Louisiana, Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Rockfield in Maryland. Each received small groups of women, often in units of 20 to 50. The processing phase in the United States was starkly different from Europe. Here, women were fingerprinted, interviewed, medically examined, and given prisoner uniforms, though often allowed to keep civilian clothing for comfort. Each woman was assigned a POW number and entered into a military registry. Geneva Convention protections were theoretically enforced, but inconsistently. And yet, the treatment these women received upon arrival shocked most of them. There were no beatings, no torture, no shouting, no forced confessions. The American guards were often indifferent, even friendly. Some allowed the women to keep letters, Bibles, or even photos from home. Others chatted with the prisoners as if they were foreign exchange students, not wartime captives. The food was plentiful, sometimes too plentiful, with German prisoners gaining weight compared to the ration-starved populations back home. The camps, while not luxurious, were organized, clean, and structured. Many of the women were housed in barracks previously occupied by American servicewomen. To many of these prisoners, the most baffling part wasn't the good treatment. It was the complete lack of fear from their captors. The Americans didn't seem to view them as dangerous. No one shouted in their faces. No one accused them of war crimes. No one even watched them very closely. Some of the women began to ask each other the same thing. Are we really prisoners? Or guests? This wasn't mercy. It was policy, part of the US military's adherence to the Geneva Convention, and a long-term strategy to maintain moral high ground in the post-war order. But not all would go smoothly. Some of the women felt isolated. Others were confused by the cultural differences. Many had no idea how long they would be held, or what would happen to their families back home. The next step of their journey would bring even more surprises. Train rides across the vast American landscape, with no guards, no chains, and no answers. Tucked away in the piney woods of northwestern Louisiana, Camp Ruston was one of the largest prisoner-of-war camps in the United States during World War II. Built in 1942, it sprawled across over 700 acres and eventually housed more than 4,000 Axis prisoners, most of them German. But by the summer of 1945, a curious new group arrived: women. The American military had not prepared for this. The infrastructure at Camp Ruston, like almost every other US POW camp, was designed entirely for male prisoners. Female prisoners were such a rarity that their arrival caused confusion among both the guards and the local community. Yet the army made quick adjustments. Separate barracks were established, a female-only compound was sectioned off, and women were given relative privacy, though still surrounded by barbed wire. The women were mostly former Red Cross nurses and Helferinnen, uniformed auxiliaries captured alongside male soldiers. Their numbers were small, perhaps a few dozen in Ruston, and similar numbers in other camps like Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Rockfield in East Maryland, and a handful of smaller facilities in Texas and Arkansas. They were scattered, outnumbered, and often forgotten in the paperwork of mass military bureaucracy. But within these isolated compounds, something unusual happened. A quiet normalization of life. At Camp Ruston, the women were issued Geneva Convention cards and given access to mail. They could write letters, though these were censored, and occasionally receive parcels from the German Red Cross. Many took part in educational classes, a US Army initiative designed to promote democratic values among prisoners. Courses ranged from English language and American history to agriculture and bookkeeping. The goal was partly political. The US hoped to re-educate POWs and prepare them to return to a post-Nazi Germany with new ideas about democracy and freedom. For many of the women, especially those indoctrinated since childhood by Nazi propaganda, this was a disorienting experience. But it wasn't just the classes that reshaped their views. There was food, more than most had seen in years. Each POW received a standard US Army ration: meat, vegetables, fruit, milk, bread, amounting to over 3,000 calories per day. Compared to war-ravaged Germany, where civilians were surviving on watery soup and potato peelings, it felt like luxury. Some women gained significant weight. Others, out of guilt or pride, refused to eat at first, believing they were being fattened for propaganda or humiliation. The guards, meanwhile, didn't fit any of the caricatures they'd been taught. There were no beatings, no shouting, no harassment. In many cases, guards treated prisoners with casual indifference. For the American military, these women posed little threat. They weren't going to dig tunnels or mount escape attempts. Some were even allowed to walk unescorted within camp boundaries. In Camp McCoy, several women were placed in kitchen duty or laundry services. In Camp Ruston, a few were assigned to translation tasks, given their English proficiency. Others simply passed the time reading, knitting, or teaching one another. One woman, a former music student from Hamburg, organized small choral groups, singing German folk songs that echoed through the Louisiana trees. But even in this relative calm, the women were never allowed to forget where they were, or what had happened to their country. News trickled in slowly. Letters spoke of firebombed cities, missing brothers, or starving parents. Some of the women, only in their early 20s, broke down in tears reading the destruction of Dresden, Hamburg, or Berlin. A few months earlier, They had been serving what they believed was a righteous cause. Now, that cause had vanished. Their leaders were dead or captured. Their cities were rubble. Their uniforms no longer meant power. They were symbols of loss. And yet, America didn't treat them as enemies to be punished. This was intentional. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were to be treated with dignity, given food, shelter, and medical care. The United States adhered closely to these rules, not only out of principle, but also because 120,000 American POWs were still in German and Japanese hands, and US officials feared retribution if their own soldiers were mistreated. But there was also something deeper, an American belief, at least among many, that once someone surrendered, they were no longer an enemy, but a human being. For the German women, this was the most profound shock of all. One Red Cross nurse, 24 years old, later recalled, "They treated us like people, not prisoners. It confused me more than anything the war had done." Still, not everyone in the US felt the same. While the camps were largely kept out of the public spotlight, local newspapers occasionally mentioned Axis women being held in facilities nearby. Some citizens expressed outrage. Why were German women, whose country had bombed London and sent millions to death camps, being treated better than black Americans in segregated towns just outside the camp fences? This contradiction didn't go unnoticed by the prisoners. Some, upon seeing segregation in the American South, questioned what kind of freedom this democracy really offered. Others, ironically, felt freer in captivity than they had under Nazi supervision. By mid-1945, the war in Europe was over. Japan would soon follow. The camps began preparing for repatriation, but not before one final, astonishing detail emerged. The journeys these women had taken across the country, often without any armed guards. The story of unguarded train rides would become the most symbolic and baffling chapter of their time in America. By the time most German women POWs arrived at Camp Ruston or other US detention facilities, they had already experienced what they would later describe as the most surreal part of their captivity: the journey there. The train rides, no fences, no chains, and, shockingly, no armed guards in sight. Accounts from both former prisoners and US military records confirm what sounds, even today, almost unbelievable. Female German POWs were transported across hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles of American soil by rail, largely unguarded. These weren't secret military convoys under heavy lock and key. In many cases, the women were seated in standard passenger cars, wearing civilian coats over their uniforms, with only minimal supervision. A single officer or escort might travel in the same car, but weapons were rarely visible, and no formal restraints were used. Sometimes, train conductors didn't even know who the passengers were. One woman recalled sitting by the window, staring in disbelief at the passing American towns. "We passed farms, stations, even children playing. No one looked at us twice." Another POW said she was terrified not of the guards, but of the freedom itself. "I kept expecting someone to shoot me for trying to escape, even though I never tried." Why did the US military allow this? The answer lies in a mix of pragmatism, policy, and a very American kind of confidence. By 1945, the US held hundreds of thousands of Axis POWs. The risk of escape, especially by women, was deemed extremely low. These prisoners were in a foreign land, didn't speak the language, had no local support, and were often disoriented after long voyages. The idea that they would leap from a moving train and survive in small-town America was considered absurd. But it went deeper than just logistics. The US military trusted its own system. The American home front was a closed world, safe, patrolled, insulated from invasion or sabotage. The notion that an unarmed German nurse could vanish into the Kansas countryside didn't even register as a threat. And to their surprise, the women never tried. For many, the very idea of running made no sense. Where would they go? Who would take them in? Unlike the men, some of whom attempted daring escapes, the women didn't have the same networks, survival training, or sense of military pride that might have driven them to flee. Most were clerks, aides, and support staff, not hardened soldiers. And then there was something even more powerful at play: shock. These women had been raised in a totalitarian regime. Their education, media, and military indoctrination had painted Americans as violent, immoral monsters, enemies who would torture and execute them the moment they surrendered. But instead of punishment, they were met with indifference, or even politeness. This emotional dissonance was so profound that it paralyzed any thought of rebellion. The absence of guards didn't feel like freedom. It felt like psychological whiplash. One prisoner later wrote, "We were more afraid of the kindness than the cruelty. It meant everything we believed was a lie." Military documents suggest that the US knew this. Officials calculated that the psychological impact of humane treatment was more effective than chains. And it worked. The vast majority of these women simply sat on the train, quietly, obediently, trying to make sense of the new world around them. They stared out the windows at a nation untouched by war, well-fed citizens, unbombed towns, and wide open landscapes. The contrast with Germany's smouldering ruins couldn't have been more jarring. Occasionally, passengers or station staff would notice the groups of quiet, uniformed women and ask questions. But censorship and wartime secrecy kept most Americans in the dark. These weren't parades of prisoners, just quiet shadows passing through. In some cases, the trains stopped in segregated towns, where Black Americans had to ride in separate cars or wait in different waiting rooms. German women POWs noticed this too, and it confused them. Why were they, the enemies, allowed to ride freely while US citizens lived under restrictions? They had escaped a fascist state only to witness a democracy with its own contradictions. But the trains kept moving, and so did time. By the end of their journey, many of the women stepped onto the platforms of places like Ruston or McCoy with a strange blend of emotions: fear, confusion, guilt, and gratitude. They hadn't escaped. They hadn't been punished. They had simply arrived. Their war wasn't over, but it had taken a turn no one, least of all them, had expected. For most Americans during World War II, the idea that German prisoners, especially women, were being held in their own backyards was unimaginable. The government didn't advertise it, and the media rarely covered it. With the war raging across continents, the average American citizen had bigger concerns: rationing, casualty reports, and waiting for loved ones to return home. Still, the presence of over 400,000 Axis POWs in the US didn't go completely unnoticed. Local newspapers occasionally ran short articles or grainy photos of smiling German prisoners playing soccer or working on farms. These stories were often framed in terms of American decency, highlighting how even enemies were treated humanely. But very few reports ever mentioned the existence of female German POWs. Why the silence? Part of the answer lies in optics. Images of young German women being housed, fed, and cared for, especially while American women were welding, nursing, and sacrificing on the home front, risked sparking public outrage. The notion that enemy women were receiving government meals and warm beds while US families rationed meat and gasoline didn't sit well with everyone. Behind the scenes, there was a real awareness of this risk. The War Department issued strict instructions: no interviews, no photographs, and no public access to female POW compounds. Even camp personnel were advised to minimize conversations about the women, emphasizing security concerns. But secrecy didn't mean invisibility. In places like Louisiana, Wisconsin, and Maryland, word still got out. Locals living near camps would catch glimpses of female prisoners walking to mess halls or hanging laundry. Rumors spread. Some townspeople assumed they were refugees or displaced Europeans. Others guessed they were collaborators. The truth, that these were German enemy combatants held on US soil, was almost too strange to believe. The response was mixed. Some communities responded with curiosity and even kindness. A few US camp workers reportedly treated the women with respect, speaking German or gifting them small items. Others, especially veterans or families of those killed in Europe, were angry and suspicious, questioning why enemy nationals were being shown any comfort at all. The racial dynamics added another layer of contradiction. In the American South especially, German POWs, both men and women, were often treated better than black American citizens. While white German prisoners sat in open rail cars, unguarded, black Americans were still riding in segregated coaches. In towns like Ruston, black workers were barred from entering certain restaurants, but German POWs could be seen eating US Army meals 3 times a day. To some, this was infuriating. To others, deeply confusing. From a military perspective, this treatment wasn't kindness for kindness' sake. It was strategy. The US wanted to set a global example, to show it honored the Geneva Convention, even when its enemies didn't. By ensuring POWs were fed, sheltered, and educated, the US hoped to gain post-war moral authority and encourage the humane treatment of its own soldiers overseas. Ironically, some of the most favorable accounts of the US during World War II came from its prisoners, including German women who later returned home and shared stories that contradicted everything they had believed. But they didn't always speak openly. Many returned to a defeated, suspicious Germany. Talking about good treatment in America risked alienating neighbors, or worse, being labeled a traitor. So their experiences faded into silence, unrecorded, untaught. For decades, their presence in America remained a footnote, absent from textbooks, documentaries, and wartime memoirs. It wasn't until researchers in the 1990s and 2000s began interviewing surviving POWs and declassifying camp records that the full scope of this story began to emerge. And still, the image remains startling. Young women from a defeated regime riding unguarded through the land of their enemy, and being treated not with hatred, but with unexpected dignity. When the war ended in the summer of 1945, the future of the German POWs held in the United States, including the women, was suddenly uncertain. Victory in Europe didn't bring instant repatriation. Bureaucracy, international negotiations, and post-war instability delayed their return. Some women remained in US camps well into 1946, unsure of what, if anything, was left waiting for them in Germany. When repatriation finally came, it was quiet and without ceremony. The same unguarded trains that had carried them to places like Camp Ruston now transported them back to ports on the East Coast. From there, they boarded ships that crossed the Atlantic in reverse, no longer under military watch, but under the shadow of what their homeland had become. What they returned to was devastation. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Food shortages were rampant. Families had been split apart, some never to be reunited. Many of the women who had served as auxiliaries returned home, not to celebration, but to suspicion. Their uniforms marked them not as victims of war, but as former instruments of a disgraced regime. For years, many remained silent about their time in the United States, speaking openly about good treatment as a prisoner, especially under American custody, could be seen as unpatriotic or even traitorous. West Germany was trying to rebuild, and the narrative focused on hardship, loss, and reconstruction. Not stories of well-fed prisoners thousands of miles away. Some women wrote memoirs, decades later, often privately published or circulated within families. A few gave interviews to historians, but the public record remained limited. Only in recent years have scholars and documentary filmmakers begun piecing together the stories of these women. Not as Nazi loyalists, but as individuals, each with their own path, their own perspective, their own reckoning. And what emerges from their stories is not just a tale of wartime logistics or international law. It is something more human, something deeply paradoxical. These women had grown up in a regime that demanded obedience, worshipped strength, and demonized the enemy. They had been taught that to fall into Allied hands was a death sentence, that the Americans would violate, humiliate, and execute them. Instead, they rode trains through peaceful countryside, were offered soap, bread, and books, learned English, sat in classrooms, watched American guards toss baseballs, smoke cigarettes, and talk about going home to their wives. The shock of this dissonance was profound. It didn't turn all of them into believers in democracy, but it left an impression, one that many wrestled with for the rest of their lives. And what of the Americans? For the most part, they forgot. The presence of German women POWs in the US was so small, so scattered, and so shrouded in wartime secrecy that the memory faded quickly. Unlike male POWs, who sometimes stayed after the war, married locals, or maintained contact with host families, the women disappeared into history. No monuments, no headlines. Just a few lines in dusty archives. Yet their story poses deep questions. Questions still relevant today. What does it mean to treat the enemy with dignity? Can compassion coexist with war? How do propaganda and fear cloud our judgment, not just of others, but of ourselves? In treating these women with respect, the United States wasn't just following the Geneva Convention. It was making a statement about who it was and who it wanted to be. Yes, there were contradictions. Segregation persisted, inequities flourished. The very freedom shown to foreign prisoners was often denied to American citizens of color. But even within that flawed system, there existed a remarkable truth. In the midst of global war, a train full of enemy women could ride through a country they were taught to fear, without guards, without chains, and without incident. That moment, small, forgotten, almost unbelievable, is not just a historical footnote. It's a challenge, a reminder that sometimes strength is shown not in how we fight, but in how we treat those who can no longer fight back. And perhaps, in the quiet rumble of an unguarded train car, we hear something more powerful than any weapon, the sound of a nation choosing restraint over revenge. So what stories have we forgotten? And what would we discover if we chose to remember them? If this story moved you, share it. These hidden chapters of history deserve to be known. Subscribe for more untold truths that reshape how we see the past and ourselves.